Here are two movies about real-life serial killer cases that were never solved. Both feature young, idealistic newspaper employees who take a special interest in the murders. These protagonists then team up with a more experienced colleague who shows them the ropes, befriend a cop who gets them inside info, and gradually become obsessed while everyone else begins to move on, which in turn hurts their respective marriages, puts them in one especially unnerving situation as a source turns eerily suspect, and altogether deteriorates their lives until they eventually find some resolution that allows them to let go even as the official case status remains inconclusive. One of these movies is Boston Strangler. It was released in 2023 and it's okay. Like, it's a pretty straightforward account, it's restrained and thoughtful and respectful, so much so even that despite the intensity of its subject matter, the whole thing actually feels a bit dull and forgettable. But the other movie, well, this one's directed by David Fincher. Even at almost 20 years old, Zodiac's opening scene remains as provocative as ever, and it's not even the most disturbing one in the movie. In fact, everything about Zodiac feels immaculately designed to get under your skin, which is true for most movies in David Fincher's by now extensive filmography. There's just something about the way he films that always feels strangely intrusive, strangely intimate, like he's always touching some dark, forbidden truth.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, and we tolerate it.
But while there is plenty that has already been said about the more technical aspects of Fincher's filmmaking philosophy, the way he carefully calibrates the movement of the camera to that of the characters, the way he seamlessly integrates CGI into his movies, and the way he made Andrew Garfield smash like 20 laptops to get the perfect take in The Social Network. This alone doesn't explain why his movies feel like that, doesn't explain what they're doing on a deeper thematic level. In other words, what is David Fincher's secret? What, if anything, is the real driving force of his filmmaking philosophy?
I think people are perverts. I've maintained that. That's the foundation of my career.
While at first glance, Fincher's statement seems to suggest that he merely believes that people secretly get a kick out of the excessive violence and other provocative elements that are often found in his movies. If you dig a little deeper, there's actually a lot more beneath the surface that, for me, opened up an entirely new perspective on and a much deeper appreciation for Fincher's filmography. For in psychoanalytical terms, the word perversion doesn't point to some kind of depravity. It is not an exceptional pathology that only a few suffer from. Rather, it relates to a more structural configuration in the way that all human desire functions, and which seems to form the linchpin of most of David Fincher's characters.
What are you doing? Living amongst the normies?
As Jacques Lacan, one of the most prominent psychoanalysts of the 20th century, famously stated, man's desire is the desire of the other. What did he mean by this? Well, it's not just that we have a mimetic desire. It's not just that we want what others have or want to be like others are. No, the other here refers to a more complex set of societal expectations, cultural norms, linguistic constructs and ideals, knowledge, conformity, likability, marriage, aesthetics, pretty much everything that interacts with our human subjectivity, and from which we derive identity and meaning.
I'd flip through catalogs and wonder, what kind of dining set defines me as a person?
And what Lacan argues is that when all of our needs are met, when we have attained everything we could possibly conceive of and ask from this other, security, wealth, relationships, understanding, there will still be a lack that is never fully satisfied, always be more want for something that we cannot even articulate. This, to Lacan, is the meaning of desire. It is the inner void within us that can never be filled because it seeks something from the other that cannot be given, something more fundamental that the world simply doesn't offer. It's the longing for some kind of existential wholeness, some kind of guarantee that would affirm and validate our existence, some kind of answer to life's impossible questions.
No, he wants more than readership. He wants more than adulation. He wants love.
The primal questions of any marriage. What are you thinking? How are you feeling?
So why is this seen as perverted? Because by being tethered to a structural lack, by being essentially unsatisfiable, desire cannot move in a straight line towards fulfillment, and so instead, it loops around it, it finds detours and substitutes, it tries to imagine what the other wants that would grant fulfillment, tries to make itself the object of the other's desire. Hence, man's desire is the desire of the other.
I'm just saying I need to do something substantial in order to get the attention of the close.
But by always being based on this imaginary leap, by always going around in a circle, chasing the desire of the other does not replace the satisfaction of fulfillment. Rather, it merely sustains the dynamic that causes one's own desire in the first place. This is the perversion. Desire is not about actually trying to get what we want. It is about finding something that keeps desire alive.
I need to know who he is. I need to stand there. I need to look him in the eye. And I need to know that it's him.
To understand how this form of desire comes into being, we also have to talk about what Lacan refers to as the gaze. In short, if human desire is structured around a fundamental lack, the gaze is how that lack erupts into the field of vision. Unlike later film theory concepts like the male gaze, the gaze in Lacan's psychology is not the view through our own eyes. It is not a perspective that we cast onto something. Rather, it is the imagined perspective that is cast back on us. It is the feeling of being seen from a position beyond our control.
Somebody else is here.
It is a public park.
I think he's watching us.
What's crucial here is that the gaze functions as a distortion. It is like a point of opacity or a stain that muddies our otherwise clear image. It is the unknown, the intangible, manifested into the periphery of our being, and reaching deep into our subconscious where it upsets the stability of our psychological structure by interrupting our illusion of control and mastery.
And I joke about it, but there was a kind of turning point at that moment. I really did question whether or not my parents were capable of taking care of us.
As a young boy growing up in the San Francisco area and going to school on the same bus that the Zodiac had threatened to attack, Fincher clearly gained an intimate understanding of what makes the gaze so unsettling as an instinctual driving force. And as a meticulous filmmaker, he also knows, perhaps unlike any other, how to utilize it as a powerful cinematic tool.
Who was that, Tony?
Don't worry about it.
Taking another look at their respective opening scenes, there is a notable difference between Zodiac and the movie Boston Strangler in how they approach perspective. In Boston Strangler, the first murder is indirectly witnessed by a neighbor, and subsequently, we too become a disconnected observer to the act. But in Zodiac, we're firmly locked into the perspective of the victims as they slowly come to realize they are being watched, as they slowly become the object of the gaze.
Let's go.
This is how Fincher makes that deep instinctual connection to the audience. This is how he gets under your skin, not through his depiction of graphic violence, but through the way he invokes the gaze, the way he confronts his characters and us with an unknown presence that feels like it's always observing them. And he sustains this immaculately throughout the movie. Whereas Boston Strangler never seems quite sure where to place the camera, and alternates between various angles like putting us at a distance as a more neutral spectator, over the shoulder as if we're assuming the perspective of the killer preying on his victim, or locked on a random object as if we're averting our eyes from the terrifying act happening just off screen. Fincher, on the other hand, always keeps us firmly at the mercy of the Zodiac's gaze, which again is not the killer's direct point of view, but his ever-observing eye as it is felt by the other characters.
I'm not the Zodiac. And if I was, I certainly wouldn't tell you.
And it's not just in the scenes that directly involve the killer or the person suspected of being the killer. No, through his careful command over perspective, Fincher manages to turn the Zodiac into a constant ominous presence that, at any moment, can transform the investigating subject into the object of investigation, and the promising moment of discovery into a suddenly dreadful one of being somehow found out.
Are you sure there's nobody else in the house?
But despite being unsettling, or perhaps rather, because it is unsettling, because it creates a tear in the fabric of our subjective reality, the gaze also has a certain magnetizing effect that draws us in, that hooks our attention, and which adds another seemingly paradoxical dimension to it, which is excitement.
You don't have to stay.
Are you kidding? This is the most interesting date I've ever had.
This is what makes the gaze so intrinsically linked to desire. It provides a mystery to solve, an enigma to master, one that gives us an articulation of that desire of the other, gives us a puzzle of which we can believe that, if we solve it, we will receive that deeper resolution, that sort of ultimate affirmation that we so naturally crave.
Because I think that Robert found it actually fun. I think that's what's hard for people to understand, is that this man enjoyed searching for this person. Whereas a cop would have done it because it was his job, or a journalist would have done it as his job, he really had fun.
So, when combining our perverted desire, our endless pursuit to satisfy a fundamental lack, with the gaze, which is the visual sign of that lack, what we end up with is a feedback loop in which each encounter with the gaze reaffirms the lack, and in which each reaffirmation of the lack amplifies desire. From this then emerges what Lacan refers to as jouissance, which is a term that seeks to capture a kind of enjoyment, a certain gratifying subjective experience that is hard to express in language, but which gives us some insight into why one would want to keep this feedback loop in place. Jouissance goes beyond the experience of simple pleasure, goes beyond the joyful feeling of satisfying a specific need. In fact, pursuing jouissance often goes at the expense of other needs. It triggers a kind of compulsion that can, as paradoxical as it sounds, include frustration, pain, and self-sabotage. How so exactly? Well, that's probably best demonstrated by Robert in Zodiac. For if we look closer at his character progression, it's not just that his obsession with the case causes him to neglect his personal life. No, in some way it's actually because his social standing was already lacking.
Does anyone ever call me names?
You mean like retard?
That the case becomes of interest to him. And later on it's because his marriage and his career begin to deteriorate that his investment intensifies.
Just need to confirm a date.
Mr. Graysmith.
I've narrowed it down between the 18th and the 20th of December,
And this is because to Robert, the enigma of the Zodiac Killer had become his main object of desire, had become that elusive thing that, if deciphered, if mastered, will retroactively give meaning to all the sacrifices that he made and to restore his place before the other. Or to put it like this, finding the Zodiac will, in his own perception, make him matter again to his family, his colleagues, the cops, the public, the course of history, and, ultimately, to himself.
If it was so fucking important, what did you ever do? You hovered over my desk, you stole from wastebaskets. Am I being unkind?
And so, with every deflection, every setback, with every occurrence in which the gap between Robert and those around him widens, he becomes all the more motivated to find the Zodiac, and all the more excited when some new clue is found or some new path of exploration opens up. To be fair, the movie does have the benefit of history here, because unlike in Boston Strangler, where the titular serial killer didn't leave many clues except for a passive calling card, and where the trail towards catching him runs cold pretty quickly, both of which undermine that feedback loop of desire. In Zodiac, the killer is actively provoking the police, the press, and the general community through letters, ciphers, phone calls, and interviews through which he maintains his presence, and through which Fincher can keep insisting his gaze.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Take this scene, for example, in which the first Zodiac letter arrives at the newspaper station, and where Fincher, after initially struggling to figure out the blocking, decides to dictate the flow of the scene based on the movement of the letter, i.e., the gaze of the Zodiac killer, as it passes down along the various staff members until ultimately arriving at Robert.
The Zodiac letters, to me, were kind of the most important hook in the movie. They were certainly the biggest hook for me as a kid. The notion that somebody was offering you an insight into their kind of psychological makeup.
Indeed, this is why the Zodiac's correspondence, and Fincher's integration of it, is so important as an energizing force of the movie. It's because each letter, each cipher, functions as a signifier of the Zodiac's gaze that reactivates the circuit of desire, offering a new clue that, like a shepherd tone, brings closer the promise of revelation while also deferring any actual resolution. It's the active mystery of the Zodiac that guarantees the feedback loop.
This is the Zodiac speaking. I'm back with you. Tell Herb Cain I am here. I have always been here.
This active mystery is also sustained by the failure of the symbolic order around Robert. That is, the failure of the institutions that are supposed to organize anomalies such as the Zodiac into the ordinary, into stable systems of meaning. The movie persistently shows these institutions fragmenting and causing disorder. Police departments in different counties fail to coordinate, evidentiary standards shift, handwriting analyses conflict, timelines remain partial.
This suspect is not your Zodiac.
The symbolic order cannot integrate the Zodiac, which in turn allows for the imaginary compensations that drive Robert. The speculative pattern making, the pet theories, the redacted files treated as treasure maps. Again, Fincher viscerally brings us into the obsession. Time passes without closure, montages keep feeding fragments of archival media without unifying them. The entire cinematic experience becomes one that can be described as sliding, as moving around without finding a definitive anchoring point, thereby rerouting itself back into obsession, and once more demonstrating the structural perversion at the heart of desire.
So do whatever you have to. But finish this.
It's a newspaper story, and that gradually becomes a story about, justice, or the obsession with justice, and what is justice? Where can you feel good? At what point can you let go?
As the years pass, it becomes increasingly clear that Robert's obsession with the Zodiac killer is no longer really a matter of public safety.
Zodiac hasn't written in 3 years. You know how many murders we've had in San Francisco since then?
Do you know that more people die in the East Bay commute every 3 months than that idiot ever killed?
It crystallizes how for Robert, catching the Zodiac was never really about serving the greater good. Instead, he wanted to be the one who solved the mystery. He wanted to hold the gaze of the public, to occupy the place of the one who knows.
You went on TV. You put yourself out there for him to see.
All this brings us to the final confrontation, to the non-conclusion, if you will, which is where Fincher does something quietly fascinating. Because unlike Boston Strangler, which does eventually pretty much give us the truth,
other men used the Strangler as cover to get rid of women they didn't want around anymore.
And then shifts the dramatic focus to why that truth didn't come to light.
The entire city just wanted to move on.
And to what this means thematically.
Men kill women.
Fincher instead weaponizes doubt until the very end, putting us just within reach of the truth, but never fully letting us grab it.
How sure are you? I'm pretty sure.
In doing so, he confronts us directly, or at least as directly as possible, with the void, with that foundational lack at the heart of Robert's desire, that unfillable hole from which the gaze erupted into his field of vision to begin with. Lacan also refers to this as the real, which is that aspect of our subjective experience that fundamentally resists symbolization, that cannot be captured in language or image, that cannot be solved or made sense of. This, to Robert, was the Zodiac, not a secret identity, but an eternal enigma, like a kind of psychological antimatter that has been driving his intangible obsession. And it's that understanding that makes his final encounter with Arthur Lee Allen so eternally haunting.
Can I help you?
No.
Because from this perspective, the scene doesn't suggest that Robert makes peace with himself because he, in his own mind, has found his killer. Rather, he is able to let go because it is in that moment, standing in front of his main suspect, that he realizes he is still as far removed as he ever was, and that he's never going to find the conclusive answer he desired. It is the acknowledgement that the Zodiac was never just some guy, but a construct that was built around and subsequently supported by the unknowable, by the real. In other words, what Robert comes to terms with here is that his true Zodiac is not the unreachable object behind Lee's suggestive yet inconclusive facial expression. Rather it is, and had always been, that expression itself. It had always been that which stood in the way of resolution that was the real driving force of desire, and which marked the true connection to the real.
This would be maybe the best idea of the real, that imagine falsifying something through distortions. But imagine that these distortions retroactively create that which is falsified. So that if you erase distortions, you lose the distorted thing itself. This would be then the real.
There was a real person who committed these murders, but by never being caught, he also became something else. He became an unresolved tear in the subjective worlds of those whose lives got caught in his wake, a manifestation of the intangible whose gaze lingers to this day, and which makes him an everlasting object of perverted desire.
Don't call asking what the object of the game is, figuring that out is the object of the game.
It is but one of many expressions of that greater enigma that keeps awakening a morbid fascination within the characters of David Fincher's movies, forming different articulations of that which promises to fulfill a deeper yearning, yet which, more often than not, only results in self-sabotaging obsessions.
All we did was resent each other and try to control each other and cause each other pain.
That's marriage.
And it is through his high-precision filmmaking that Fincher not only immerses us into these obsessions, but also makes us complicit. In his video on Fincher's eye-tracking camera work, the Nerdwriter explains how the near-perfect tracking of character movement makes him feel more connected to them. But I'd argue it also has more of an opposite effect. By locking onto their eyes, we do not connect to these characters as much as they make a connection to us. It is we who become trapped in their gaze, which opens up an enigma within our own psychic structure that plunges us into the same feedback loop of desire, gives us the same jouissance that comes from circling an unresolvable object, which might be what makes Fincher's movies so endlessly rewatchable. Though I actually think there's also a deeper reason for that, because more than just cruelly letting us chase a desire that is never fulfilled, more than merely tricking us through cheap manipulations of our instinctual driving forces, I believe it is precisely because Fincher lets people vicariously indulge in an experience of desire that he is able to excavate its dynamics and momentarily break the spell of obsession, thereby giving us a brief release from our own perverted selves.
I remember because Zodiac was such a kind of a personal thing, and nobody really had an answer. So when I read the script, there was an answer to why there was no answer. It was kind of a cathartic thing.
The need to feel secure, it's a slippery slope. If you can't accept this, well, maybe you're not one of the few. Maybe you're just like me. One of the many.
Though the problem of desire is one that cannot be definitively resolved, as the lack will always exist in our heart in some form or another, Lacan argued that we can change how we live with it by recognizing it as a structural configuration instead of a mistake to be fixed. Do not give up on your desire, Lacan stated, by which he meant that we shouldn't try to repress desire. It is, after all, still one of our most foundational driving forces, but rather that we use it more consciously to examine the actual wants beneath our obsessions, to avoid ideals that promise some kind of absolute fulfillment, and to learn and live alongside a void that will never be filled. Interestingly enough, it is actually one of the most archetypal themes communicated through cinema. Letting go of destructive patterns, breaking free from debilitating societal norms, making peace with the unknowable and the unattainable. And to find such transformative movies, I highly recommend friend of the channel and my favorite online cinema, Mubi. Mubi is my personal go-to platform to really explore the riches of cinema. They offer hand-picked films from around the globe, from timeless masterpieces to hidden gems and festival favorites. There are even curated series and specials that are really fun if you want to explore a specific theme, era, or director. And so, whether you are new to cinema or a veteran cinephile, with Mubi you'll never run out of things to watch. And if you sign up using my personal link, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold, you can try Mubi for free for 30 days. So be sure to claim your extended free trial to start your free month of great cinema today.